Good morning, and thank you very much to everyone in the United States and Canada that is joining us for today's webinar. And good afternoon and good evening to our friends in Iceland and Europe and elsewhere who are also joining us. We're really excited today to talk about 100% whitefish. I'm David Naftzger, the Executive Director for the Conference of Great Lakes, St. Lawrence Governors and Premiers, and we've been real pleased to work with a very talented project team, including Dr. Alexandra Leeper, the Director of Research and Innovation with the Iceland Ocean Cluster, who will be our featured speaker today. In terms of format, I'll be making some brief remarks to begin our conversation and talk to you a little bit about the context and background for 100% whitefish and our broader 100% Great Lakes fish work. We'd encourage you to ask questions or a comment. You can post those by clicking the Ask a Question button in the interface. We'll be taking your questions at the conclusion of all of the presentations and really looking forward to having this be a discussion with all of you. We will be recording today's webinar and making that available on our website at www.gsgp.org. And you will also be finding later this week a copy of the 100% Whitefish Report that Dr. Leeper will be discussing. Without further ado, I would like to begin the slide presentation and would ask that the first slide be posted. Thank you. Next slide, please. The Conference of Great Lakes St. Lawrence Governors and Premiers is a partnership of the governors from the 8 U.S. states that border the Great Lakes, as well as the Canadian premiers from Ontario and Quebec. We coordinate a portfolio of projects based around environmental protection and regional economic development, and very pleased to work with our chair, Governor Tony Evers from Wisconsin, and our vice chair, Governor Mike DeWine from Ohio. Next slide. Much of our work in recent years has been animated around this concept of the working Great Lakes and thinking about different ways that we can use our waters in ways that are more sustainable and even restorative in some cases. Moving from a way of using water that degrades it in one way or another to a way that's sustainable in its very nature. This involves tourism, maritime transportation, and most recently, commercial fish. Next slide. When we think about fish, most of us think about a fillet, and the thought process kind of begins and ends at the beginning of this diagram. But when you think about the fish as a collection of different parts, you begin to think about it very differently. And this slide's from the Iceland Ocean Cluster, illustrating the different kinds of component parts that can be taken from a fish, whether it's the skin, the scales, the frames, the bones, the viscera, different components that can be extracted and used in different ways to create different products, with the ultimate goal being zero waste. Flip side of that, the idea is 100% fish. Next slide. So the Iceland Ocean Cluster has had tremendous success with the 100% fish model. The Icelandic cod decades ago suffered a significant decline in its stocks. And at that time, almost exclusively the fish was being used for its fillet. While the important work took place to restore the stocks, a parallel effort began to try to look at ways to extract maximum value from each caught fish. This had the result of moving the biomass utilization from about 40%, the fillet, toward upwards of 80%. Commercial products have been made from various components of the fish, driving the total value of fish from the low tens of dollars all the way over $4,000. Now, this doesn't mean that each cod is worth $4,000, but rather that the products that are made from a single fish exceed that figure. So really a remarkable success story, and this model is now being applied globally. Next slide. So here's another illustration of 100% fish oriented around the different products that can be made from, in this case, the Icelandic cod. You see pharmaceuticals, nutritional supplements, fashion products, a whole range of different food and non-food-based products, all of which contribute value to the fishery and to the fish-based economy. This has been a very important driver in Iceland and has the same potential for us here in the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence region. Next slide. So today's whitefish fishery looks a lot like the cod fishery did years ago. an almost exclusive focus on value creation out of the fillet, and in most cases, the remainder of the fish being used for animal feed, or in some cases being landfilled. Now, there are some examples of fish meal being used for fertilizer and some other types of products, but this represents the lion's share of the whitefish-based economy. We also see increasing competition from other fish and non-fish-based products, and a real competitive challenge for the whitefish fishery going forward into the future. We look at this challenge and say, this is also a whitefish opportunity if we look at it from the 100% fish lens. Next slide. So we've been very fortunate to work with a very talented group of partners on this project, and I'd particularly like to recognize the financial support that's been provided from the Great Lakes Fishery Trust. This has been instrumental in enabling all of the work to be done. Our project team includes the Iceland Ocean Cluster. It includes representatives of state and provincial government. It includes representatives from tribes and intertribal organizations. And it also represents companies involved in the commercial fish industry, including processing. Altogether, this has brought a real diversity of perspectives and expertise to the work. And as a result, it's become much, much stronger. Next slide. Tribal engagement has been a cornerstone of the project from its inception. Tribes are not stakeholders, but rather are governments and have interests above and beyond their reliance on fish for human consumption. There are rights to fish and harvest throughout the ceded territories. And the tribes bring a perspective also around trying to use 100% of each caught fish. So this has been a very important collaboration, and we look forward to continuing to work together with our tribal partners. Next slide. So through the 100% fish, whitefish project work, we are really trying to demonstrate a successful 100% fish model. We chose the whitefish because we had to start somewhere. And the whitefish in many ways resembled a lot of the challenges in Iceland. So there was resemblances made it kind of a natural fit. Above and beyond that, it's a fish that's caught throughout the Great Lakes. So it brought a lot of different partners to the table to begin our work. It was always seen though as a starting point and not an end point. We've been really delighted with the press coverage we've gotten. You see the launch event that we had at Chartreuse Kitchen and Cocktails in the fall. Here it's illustrated. And in just a short period of time, we've created a lot of awareness of the work that's happening and are well on our way to demonstrating this successful fish model. Next slide. So the steps for this project included sending whitefish to Iceland for testing biotechnical analysis at the Mattis Research Laboratory. We appreciate Prestige Foods providing the fish that were sent, and the analysis revealed a lot of different particular attributes of the fish that Alexandra will be speaking further to in a few moments. But whitefish are particularly suited for a number of different products, and this was an exciting revelation through the project-based work. We were able to create some prototype products representing some potential low-hanging fruit. And you see pictured on this slide some collagen that was extracted from the whitefish that were shipped, as well as some fish leather that was made from the whitefish. These are really nice products and ones that are a really good start, I think, as we think about the future economy that we might be able to build around the 100% whitefish. Next slide. So on this slide, it illustrates what we're imagining, and that is moving from the traditional whitefish-based fillet economy with animal feed to a diverse portfolio of products. They could include ones that were featured on the last slide, as well as a whole range of others. We're looking forward to working with entrepreneurs, students, researchers, and others to explore these different product ideas in coming months. Next slide. As we look to build out the whitefish work, we're also very excited to expand the work to a range of other species. This will include lake trout, walleye, white sucker, and yellow perch. In coming weeks, we'll be sending fish to Iceland to be biotechnically tested, similar to what we did with the whitefish. We'll be looking at the different attributes of the fish and identifying potential products that could be made from them. We will also be looking to create prototype products and continuing to engage a diverse group of partners and stakeholders in all of this work. Next slide. In terms of potential next steps following through, we are exploring the idea of an innovation challenge as a particular way to try to motivate people who might be interested in coming forward with their product ideas. Competition has a way of bringing out the best in a lot of us, and we think this is a particularly useful idea. Separately, we're looking to create the template for a research and development facility that could be placed somewhere in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence region as a way to enable product testing, looking at different equipment that could be used, and really helping to make it an accelerator for this transition from our traditional commercial fishery to the 100% model. Beyond this, we also are looking to build on work that's been done by the Sea Grant Network and others to look at marketing and certification programs as ways that we might be able to extract more value out of commercially harvested fish from the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence. Next slide. So that completes a very short overview of the work that we have been involved with. It's been a really exciting process, and when I think back to just about 8 months ago that we began this work, we've really come a long way. We still have a journey ahead of us, but with great partners, we're confident that we'll be successful. So with that, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Alexandra Leeper. As I mentioned, she is the Director of Research and Innovation with the Iceland Ocean Cluster. She has been leading the cluster's work with us and has been a terrific partner. We look forward to hearing from you, Alexandra.
Thank you very much, David, and it's a real pleasure to join you all here today from Reykjavik, Iceland, and really to give you a highlight of the 100% whitefish as a full report, what we did and the findings that came out of this. So without further ado and with time in mind, perhaps you can put to the next slide, because I'm going to try and give as much of an overview in this short period of time as I can of all the things that were done in the project. So to give a little bit about the background and context, which of course David has covered really nicely, so we know why this is such an important project to work on, but to explore really what biotechnological analysis that we did to look at the physical and the nutritional characteristics of those different parts of the fish, not just the fillet, those heads, those skins, those frames. And also to tell you a little bit about the site visit that myself and Dr. Thor Sigvason, the founder of the Ocean Cluster, along with some industrial partners from Marel and Curio that have a big line of automation and processing equipment, who were able to come over to the Great Lakes region. And it was extremely informative as a visit. It was really great to speak with many of the associations, with the tribes, and with the fish processing and the fisheries there, to learn and get a lot of knowledge that went into this report. And then to explore some of the main analyses that we did, which were called a value chain analysis and a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis, which I'll tell you a little bit more about, and the results that came out of this that helped us to identify what those low-hanging fruits might be from those different parts of the Great Lake whitefish, not just the fillets, but the heads, the skins, the frames, that might be those easily accessible but value add products that come from this material. And we even got a chance, like David showed you, to test a couple of prototypes and even what this might look like with some filleting machines. If you could put to the next slide, Peter. So we know, like David said, that the lake whitefish is really important. We know that it has commercial value, and it's also a fish that has faced many of the challenges that we've seen mirrored historically with the whitefish sector in Iceland. And at the start of this project, what we saw was that while the fillet is the main product, there were some small-scale uses of the side streams coming from processing, for example, going into mink feed and into potentially into fertilizers, but other than that, there weren't a huge lot of value-added applications, at least not on scale. So this was a really interesting place to start, and also good that there was this foundation built of starting to use more of the fish. So you can go to the next slide, Peter, then. So what we really wanted to do was build on the Atlantic cod and haddock pollock model that's been applied in Iceland, where we've been working with the industry and with startups and with innovation and research to build on a value pyramid to create products, not just fish meal and fertilizer, but even up the value chain, for example, into fashion products, into nutritional supplement products, and even right at the top of that value chain, things like medical grade skin grafts coming from fish skin, for example, with the really exciting company Keris in Iceland. And we've actually found this a really interesting knowledge transfer project because we also learn a lot about new species of fish as well. So you can jump to the next slide, David. Also, and so the benefit of this project really was that there was a lot of collaboration involved. We were thrilled to be connected with the Great Lakes St. Lawrence governors and premiers, but also to be bringing in our research partner in Iceland, Mattis, which is a food and biotech research company, and also those industrial partners to be able to look at this this challenge and this opportunity from a lot of different perspectives. So frozen Great Lake whitefish, kindly sent by Prestige Foods, was sent over to Iceland to have a look at a number of different aspects of them. And you can go to the next slide here. So I'm going to run through quite quickly, just really to give you the key highlights of what came out of that biotechnological analysis. But in your own time, you'll be able to look in more detail at the slides. But we looked at the whole body, the fillets, the heads, the bones, and the skin to understand what might be the applications and what might be the different values lying within these materials. So you can go to the next slide there. So we looked at how the composition and the different proportions of the body are to see that regardless of the size of the fish and regardless of which lake that they were caught from, in this case, Superior, Michigan, and Huron, the actual composition and how much of the weight was in different body parts was similar, which means similar products or ideas could be developed regardless of the size of the fish and regardless of the location. So you can go to the next slide here. And what we saw is that the fillet composition, we wanted to test that the measurements that we were carrying out in the lab here in Iceland were also matching with the literature and that it was consistent with what has already been found for Great Lake whitefish, because there is a lot of academic literature and material available. So you can jump to the next slide there. And then what we did was look at, or Mattis did, was to look at the heads of these fish and to look at the macronutritional composition. And what they saw here, they were quite excited about because they saw that there was quite a high concentration of protein, presence of protein in the head of these fish. And in general, the head of the fish is quite a good indicator of the rest of the body's composition as well. So you go to the next slide, you'll see that we've zoomed in on this to really have a look at what the amino acid profile was for these fish and for the protein in the head. So what is actually like the key building blocks for that high protein content. And the lab were particularly excited. They actually got a phone call on the day they got the results because they were seeing that the amino acids that were in high concentration there, for example, these ones highlighted in yellow, for arginine, proline, leucine, and glutamic acid, these are all those that have really interesting applications for human and animal health. For example, with arginine, we know this is an amino acid that has some benefits in terms of cell regeneration, in terms of blood clotting, as well as a number of other things. So this was a really favorable amino acid profile to be considering from these lake whitefish heads. And then you can stop to the next slide. What we saw here also was that with the bones of the fish, we were looking especially at the ash content, and we saw that this was fairly high and comparable to that of Atlantic cod. And the ash is quite indicative of the mineral content, which can, of course, be interesting potentially for supplements. So if you go to the next slide, what you'll see here and what's particularly interesting is both in terms of the phosphorus and the calcium, these were pretty high. And these are those that are very interesting and are already on the market, these minerals, into human health supplements, as well as pet food and animal food supplements. And what you also see is that on the right-hand side here, there's a measure of the amount of hydroxyproline in the bones. Hydroxyproline is an amino acid which is essentially indicative of the amount of collagen that might be able to be yielded and gelatin that might be able to be yielded from those materials. And what we saw for the bones is that this was fairly low compared to, example, for what we see in Atlantic cod, which is already being used commercially to extract collagen from. But if we zoom to the next slide, what we see is for the skin, we see this high protein content and also quite a high fat content. And then onto the next slide, what we see is this hydroxyproline again for the skin. And in this case, it's the skin and the scales combined. So the skin of lake whitefish, if you've ever seen these fish, is a very thin, delicate fish, and the scales are quite a loose, heavy scale. But when they're combined, actually the measure of this hydroxyproline, this indicator of how much collagen and gelatin there might be, this was comparable with what the labs in Matterson and Iceland have seen for Atlantic cod. We know that there is a commercializable business model with this species already. So this was really interesting to see. And then we got the opportunity, and you can pop to the next slide here, we've got the opportunity to come out with a delegation from Iceland to come and visit many of the different sites, both on the Canadian and North American side around the Great Lakes, and to talk to a lot of people and really see what was possible. And it was really highlighting a lot of interesting things for us. So I just wanted to point out two of the things that was really stood out for us as well. Because we brought obviously these teams from Marel, very into automation and equipment. It was very interesting to see that a lot of the filleting was done by hand in the Great Lakes region, and that almost every location, for example, had these descaling machines because it was better for when you're hand filleting a fish. And what that meant, and this was a really lovely surprise to us, is that at the end of the day, there was big separated buckets of scales on the processing room floor that in most cases currently were either going to incineration, landfill, or into mink feeds. But this kind of opened up a whole array of other opportunities. And it got us thinking about, okay, what things are possible and what low-hanging fruits are possible without too much changes and adaptation of the way that processing is currently done. What is a very easy accessible option? So then you can dive to the next slide here. And this explores the two key types of analysis that we did following this visit and following this nutritional analysis, and also a lot of the background research around the Great Lakes region and the lake whitefish. So the first one was called a value chain analysis, where here we look at all the activities along the value chain from source, from the inputs into the ecosystem, all the way through to the retail or the restaurant, and understanding how or where value is added at each step and how further value might be added. And then something called a SWOT analysis. And this basically we looked at every step or actor in the existing value chains for the lake whitefish and explored what the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats are. And given the time available in this case, I'm going to talk through some of the key findings of the value chain, and then I'm going to talk about the external aspects of the SWOT, so the opportunities and the threats, because I think these are the most interesting in terms of looking forward and planning. So what we saw with this primary value chain, this is obviously the dominant lake whitefish value chain, where the fillets and the dressed fish are going from and processor to the market. What we saw here is that this was, of course, the value was very much dependent on the supply, but that there was a possibility for more value to be added to these products, to this very direct value chain through, for example, marketing campaigns that add to the reputation of this fish, and also that there would be value in having monitoring the sales and the numbers over time to see how impactful this value was. I apologize, I should have said you can move to the next slide. Thank you. And so you can move to the next slide again as well, because then we go to the next kind of level of the value chain, where we look at the use of lake whitefish cut-offs in animal feeds and fertilizers. And what we saw here that is really this very mixed biomass that was going to either to landfill or to fertilizers and to animal feed, and that really there wasn't a huge amount of value, although some being brought to the processors, but there actually might be other more value-added markets. For example, fish meal into aquaculture and fish oil markets, where there is a much increased revenue value add for these materials. But what we saw also, because there were many small processing facilities, what might really add on facilitate this is a kind of a mediator role or intermediary that is able to be that facilitator that collects the cutoffs from different processes to take that, reduce the limitation of lack of storage perhaps and time availability for processes themselves, but to have this mediator role that can be that step to a value add market. And then you can pop to the next slide. And then we looked at those other kind of value-added food chains. So those ones that are, for example, making these lovely smoked whitefish salads and sausages and even pickled fish. And what we saw here is that it was a really interesting diversity of products and really delicious ones that we got to try. But there was a really a bit of an imbalance between the amount of effort that was put into these products and the added value that they were getting for the quality and the time that went into them. So what we saw here is that could be added value through higher level branding and marketing, and even collaboration with local restaurants and product vendors to really push the value up of these materials. And then you can go to the next slide. And so here we looked at the functional foods and the cosmetic value chains that weren't particularly present in the region at the moment, but we saw that there was, quite an interesting demand for them, and particularly on the market already. There are things like amino acid supplements for human nutrition, where you can, which are retailing in the US now already at about $12.33 for 10 tablets, and even calcium supplements that coming from fish bones that can retail to $30 for 120 capsules, and then collagen powder that we see retailed from fish collagen in Iceland between 10 and 15 US dollars per kilogram. And that what we saw here, what was really needed was this connection between the fisheries and the fish processing, and also the research and innovation community in order to develop some of these products for the local market and meet that value add opportunity. And then with the fashion sector, you can move to the next slide here. Really understanding that there was an opportunity in the value chain to work on a smaller scale, potentially to develop products from fish skin leather, but it would really need this collection and storage and perhaps this intermediary role in the region to add value and to make that happen. And then on the next slide here, we can see that this is just talking about the medical value chain. So this is right at the top of the value pyramid that I showed you at the beginning there, where we're talking about products that take a lot of capital, time, and research and development. These kind of high-hanging fruits like skin grafts from cod skin, but that this was a really important time to develop those connections with the research sector in order to build those value chains over time. So then you can jump to the next slide, and I'm going to talk very briefly about, I'm going to focus here on the opportunities and threats. Excuse me. So this was looking at different stages of the value chain. So starting the raw materials supply, we saw that there were really a lot of opportunities for the lake whitefish because there is a high market demand for it. It's a fish that has a very good reputation and is sold to a high-end and a mixed market as well. But really that there were threats because there are multiple environmental challenges in the Great Lakes and also external market stresses that can affect the availability and the quality of fish. So these were important parts of the raw material supply value management. You can jump to the next slide. We're here for the processing. What we saw that there was a lot of opportunity because there were facilities expanding their operations, looking at slightly more or steps towards more automation, and also towards more cold storage, which seemed to be a real limitation during our visit. But of course, that there are threats in terms of competition from imported fish and imported products from, for example, nutritional supplements even. And also, it was really dependent on the supply of quality products from the lake, and that would be a challenge potentially. And then if we look at the next stage of the value chain on the next slide, what we see for those, the distribution and the secondary value, we saw a lot of opportunities because there is a growing market both in the US and internationally for nutritional supplements, particularly, for example, post-COVID, people are looking more towards health trends and taking care of their nutritional health needs. But because of the scale of the fish processing, it really would need to be a shared challenge and a shared opportunity between the processing facilities. But there was a challenge or a bit of a threat there because of unclear legal framework. These kind of co-products haven't been developed at the secondary processing level for lake whitefish streams yet. So this was an interesting externality to see. And if you jump to the next step in the value chain, what we see here is that last stage of the value chain, and we saw actually a lot of opportunities for these kind of untapped materials, these secondary supply chains that were resources that are available, so raw materials available and a good market reputation of such a fish, but maybe a threat around the fact that consumers might be unfamiliar with these secondary or co-products coming from fish, which would kind of need this real marketing and educational push. So you can jump to the next slide. And what we see here is that based on the above analysis and on the background research, we see that we highlighted basically 3 key value chains that we felt were those low-hanging fruits from the lake whitefish and for the Great Lakes region to follow up then for product development. So first of that was the fish heads, partly because we saw this very favorable amino acid profile for human nutrition, but also because in many locations we saw that this was not a big disruption to the way that processing is already done, and there was not a huge and the fact that there is a huge market for amino acid supplements. So this was a really interesting, potentially very scalable product at the low-hanging end of the pyramid. And then next there was actually taking the scales from these fish. Like I mentioned, many of the processing facilities that we went to, there was these buckets of scales just sitting on the floor and primarily being disposed of at the moment. But we saw, because we had this very nice yield of collagen potential from the measurements we did from the scales, this could be a low-hanging fruit from a material that's already differentiated on the processing floor too, so it would not be disrupting the supply chain. And also that it would be something that has a high market value of $10 to $15 per kilogram, and then is really this high demand product in the market. And then finally, we identified leather, because what we saw was that we were particularly there during or just after the summer season, and seeing many of these small-scale artisan fisheries towns and artist goods for sale. But what we weren't seeing was anything from fish skin leather. And we've seen in Iceland that there are opportunities to do fish skin leather both on large scale or on small scale. So this really gave a nice potential to be done in a fairly low-hanging fruit module, and because there is a growing awareness of the way we can use these fish skin leathers. For example, brands like Nike, Gucci, and things like this are actually using these materials very nicely. And then you can pop to the last slide here. Hopefully you can see them. That can we looked at the use of automation with support from Marel and Curia, and we saw that we actually unfortunately tested this on frozen fish, and we see that there actually would be quite a lot of potential opportunity to use automation on fresh fillets of these fish quite successfully, that they worked well in these machines. But of course, bearing in mind they would have to be calibrated for how delicate this fish is. We were able to work with a tannery in Iceland that made the first fish skin leather and even dyed them. You can see in this picture here, they're blue and white. And to actually see how does this work, and the leather that came out of it was really high quality. And as David showed you in here in the picture too, you can see that they were explored into different actual product and accessory prototypes. And finally, we were able to see that we could actually extract collagen from both the scales and from the skin itself in order to actually test if this was at least a proof of concept. So this was really exciting. So there was obviously a lot of promise from the prototypes and from the value chains. And you can just go to the last slide here, and just to conclude that I think the full detailed report of this whole project is coming out in a couple of days, and that we really identified low-hanging fruits from the heads potentially, and from the skin and from the scales, and then on the smaller scale from the skin, and that what would be a really high priority to enable and facilitate this to happen would be an increased connectivity to the value chain, and potentially this intermediary role that could take the pressure off the processors and enable them to work together on a shared challenge of side streams in order to reach market with some different value products. And that now the next step, like David said, is that we have this opportunity to look at all these other fish species from the lake whitefish, from the Great Lakes, and use the lake whitefish as a model species. So it's a really exciting time for this project. Yeah, so thank you very much for your time for a whirlwind overview of quite a hefty report. So thank you. Oh, David, we don't hear you, or at least I don't hear you.
Let's try that again. Thank you, Alexandra, for your presentation. Covered a lot of ground in a short period of time, and really looking forward to your questions. We already have several, but just as a reminder, please use the Ask Question button in the interface to type in your question, and we will then take them in turn. I also understand that at least some of the participants may be having a difficulty seeing the slides, and that can be remedied by increasing or decreasing the screen size in your browser. If you have additional questions, you can also click Tech Support. That button is on the interface in order to get some one-on-one assistance with any technical issues that you may be having. First question we have, Alexandra, the cluster has worked obviously in Iceland with the cod and other species. You also do consulting not only here in the Great Lakes region, but elsewhere around the world. What are some of the key elements of success? We're talking about fisheries of dramatically different scale, the cod fishery being one of the largest in the world, some of the commercial fisheries here in the Great Lakes significantly smaller, and I know you've worked with ones even smaller still and elsewhere in the world, but what are kind of the building blocks or the commonalities you're seeing in terms of success?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and like I say, there are several steps really that are common regardless of the scale of the industry. And I think the first one is really understanding the material that you have, how much of it is there. This, I guess you could call it like a mapping stage, like how much material is there, where is it distributed, and really, as we've done in this report as well, understanding what is it made of really, what is the nutritional, what are the characteristics of it. So then you can kind of identify, is there a value? I guess that's the first question. Is there a value? Is it economically feasible? And then I think it's always very useful and something that across every example that we work on, we try and identify what is the most accessible way to do this without changing too much that's already within the ecosystem, already within, in this case, the fish processing, both capacity and their activities. So there's this key step there of highlighting what's a low-hanging fruit. So, for example, in Icelandic fisheries, this was two things. This was the livers. These cod livers are really big, and they've always been eaten by the fishermen on the vessels or just thrown away with the rest of the guts. And when the fishing quotas came in and when the catch started to decline, there was a real discussion of, okay, what should we do? How can we create value? And one of those first steps was saying, okay, well, we have all these livers. Why don't we keep them on board? And they had a company offering to buy them, and they had a very low-tech, low-capital input solution. That was just cold pressing the livers to start with. Now they're a bit more sophisticated with enzymes to increase the oil yield, and then cleverly marketing it. So it's a fairly big markup of 6-fold increase to have this pure Icelandic cod liver oil as a product coming from something that used to be thrown overboard. So yeah.
And that goes nicely into our next question, which is, here in the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence region, we have relatively small processing facilities and relatively smaller scale processors. You had a chance to visit several, including Prestige, John O. Foods, Cross, Grand Traverse Bay Band of Odawa Indians, and more recently we had project team members visit Bodine Fisheries in Wisconsin. But what are the issues that need to be considered when there are small, geographically dispersed processing facilities in terms of being able to reach scale that becomes economically viable with some of these value-added strategies? And what are some of the things that may have worked in Iceland or elsewhere to overcome some of those issues?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question. And I mean, in Iceland, certainly we have larger scale processing facilities and not so dispersed. We're on a small island for the most part, but I think it's very important in all cases that in order to facilitate people doing something or getting them on board with even making that effort to find more revenue, is that it's got to be it's got to make sense economically and in terms of the time of the people working there. So I think, and the challenge, of course, with smaller processing and processing that's dispersed is often, where can they put the material? How can they keep it in a state that's going to be usable for other value add products? And really, are there enough hands to do it? So I think that's one of the big challenges, and we see it in the UK fisheries likewise as well, that there's this, there has to be this cost benefit and analysis. And I think certainly what we've seen in other places, and it's certainly what we've recommended too in the report, is that I think it's done also in Canada. I spoke to someone recently by having a startup or a company that acts as an intermediary, it can take that pressure away from the small scale fisheries. So they're not having to store it, they're not having to keep it cool or even to differentiate it unless it's already being done for natural reasons like the descaling of the fish. But that an intermediary can come in as a kind of middle person in the value chain, where there is that kind of also creating employment too, and step up into value adds where they can be going around and collecting those materials and making it easy for the processors, but then also being able to add value themselves too. So in that case, like we saw with the example of the livers, something that is not too high tech or high capital. In this case, with the heads of the lake whitefish, we saw that in many cases the heads are already being separated with deheading equipment. So collecting these separately is not too difficult, but what you would need is an intermediary that could then be working with a biorefinery of sorts to process the amino acids into something else.
Thank you, and please keep your questions coming. These are some good ones. What benefits are there related to standardized product, whether that's from aquaculture or from a larger fishery where the fish are able to be separated into different categories, offering a more standardized product? How important is that to building some of these 100% fish strategies?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think we see this in a difference between the fisheries and actually the farmed fish in Iceland. Because of course, with farmed salmon, we have this really standard harvest size of fish that we know exactly where it's been. It has the same life basically, and that does make a more standardized fish like that does maybe make it applicable to more fine-tuned applications. So, for example, those that maybe you have to very quickly get it into processing. For example, in use of the enzymes from the gut, for example, this might be a case where you need to have short supply chains, you need to have a standardized model in order to enable that. But where you have a more diverse catch, let's say, and in this case, we're talking single species, but where there's a lot of variability in the size of the fish and or where it was caught, and also when is it being collected, I think then it's picking those products that maybe don't need such fine-tuned or high-level, even hygiene processes. So, for example, if that's the case, things like fish oil going into fish feeds or pet foods, which is a higher markup than that's currently being earned, but it doesn't need so much differentiation or standardization as something maybe clinical or biomedical. But I think it's certainly not essential, because there are companies, for example, Coldzyme in Iceland, and they use enzyme actually from the gut of Atlantic cod, and that's put into an oral spray that basically is creating a barrier that is a cold preventative. It creates a barrier in your throat, and this is coming from in Iceland quite a short supply chain, but of course from a variable size catch. So there are definitely opportunities to create value in both situations.
Next question was, talk about the benefits of selling into existing markets. For example, I know that marine collagen is a fairly well-established market where there may actually be some shortages or gaps that Great Lakes product could help fill immediately, versus trying to build markets. For example, fish leather is not something that's widespread in terms of its availability in North America, although we do have a producer in Minnesota who makes some wonderful products. But it's a relatively niche product at this point, so there might need to be a process of building that market. But what are the challenges or benefits of those existing markets versus building markets as we think about trying to scale this here in the region?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting and really quite different business models because, like you mentioned, with marine collagen from scales, from skin, because there is already that known market demand, and because in the case where you could gather enough scales together from enough small processes, there is the opportunity to scale quite quickly with also, for example, to produce collagen, there is plug and play style equipment in order to do that. So it's quite quick to scale and fairly quick to get to market. And of course, pretty interesting from an investor perspective, because it's something that we know there's a market for, not just in the US, but internationally. I have a colleague who works out in Japan often, and he's constantly sending me different products that have marine collagen in, not just supplements, but yogurts and all kinds of food products that you can imagine that have fish skin collagen in. So I think in terms of proving the business case and the business model to an investor and for scaling quickly, going into a known market where you know there's a demand is a very good way to do it. With things like leather, particularly when you have small scale producers, you would be probably aiming at a very different value proposition and a very different market. So particularly if you're making small artisanal goods or fashion and or luxury accessories, then you would be doing more boutique style sales. It would be much more grassroots growing up of a business model. It wouldn't be the kind of quick to scale model. It would be more like, for example, it's a non-fish example, but in Iceland there is a company called Ida Duck, and they actually do wild collection of Ida feathers from the bird's nest. It's a completely sustainable solution for this very high quality but small scale, very local, very high labor input product. But then they market it as super luxury brands and in a way that is extremely high value add. So it's really finding the market depending on what the product is that you're targeting.
Thank you. That completes the questions that are currently posted. If anyone does have an additional question, please just use the Ask Question feature in the interface, and we'll be happy to get to that. It's remarkable how Iceland has embraced the 100% fish model, having visited a few times, from the convenience stores that have drinks that include fish collagen to dried fish jerky to different items on menus at restaurants, as well as things that we're aware of, although we didn't see them firsthand with the skin grafts and everything. It's really been remarkable how in a relatively short period of time, this has really transformed the nature of the industry. One question we do get frequently is, with all the economic activity and employment and other kinds of things that are being generated around the fishery, what are the benefits like to the fishers themselves as the price generated by each fish has increased, and how do they factor into that value chain and the benefits that they may be seeing from this transformation?
I think that's a super important question. I think a very valid question as well, because it's and just to give an example perhaps of the way that it can be done and then not work for the fisheries and it not bringing that value throughout the value chain is like when you're using excess fish cutoffs into mink feed. Mink feed is being fed then into mink, and then you have this extremely up to like $9,000 for a mink coat, and that value of course is not seen by the original fisher. So this is the kind of model that doesn't maybe prove the value down the chain model. But in the case of, for example, marine collagen that you mentioned in Iceland, in this case it was a small startup that developed this idea. But what has happened there, and I think has been a really big part of their success, is that it was actually the industry, so 4 big benthic fisheries in Iceland, that then invested in this idea. So they actually pulled together their fish skin and they invested in the construction of a large-scale commercial fish skin collagen and also fish skin gelatin. facility. So in their case, in this kind of almost vertically integrated way, that they are seeing the direct value going back to the fisher. And what we find from other people using the fish skin for value adds and collagen in the drinks that you mentioned, what we see is actually the cost of fish skin is going up. It's created this kind of market domino effect that is highly beneficial for the fishery sector and bringing that revenue adds that they were targeting. So I think it's designing these and also getting the buy-in from the industry in order for them to benefit from it as well.
Well, thank you very much, Alexandra, for your presentation today, responding to all of the questions and your collaboration. The Iceland Ocean Cluster is an incredible resource for people who are interested in 100% fish. I encourage you to visit their website. Alexandra and her colleagues are also available to answer questions offline if you may have them. And we also are happy to make ourselves available as well from the Conference of Great Lakes St. Lawrence Governors and Premiers. In closing, thank you to everyone for joining us today. As was mentioned, the report, the slides, the presentations will all be available later this week at our website, gsgp.org. Also encourage you to follow us in LinkedIn. If you're not already, we post regular project updates. You can see where we'll be speaking and opportunities to get involved. So with that, we will close our session today. Thank you for everyone for joining us. Thank you to Alexandra and her colleagues from the Iceland Ocean Cluster. We look forward to great things ahead with 100% Great Lakes fish. Thank you.